Yes, so I want to take you back to life in the 70s, but Anne also mentioned in the bio something about a meeting with the Astronomer Royal. So I thought I'd kick off with that since it actually predates all of this. So just for a little bit of context, sorry, I tend to wander around, but there's a camera here, isn't there, for the online people? So maybe I'll try and... So I was born in England. My grandfather was an admiral. We won't go into his career, but it was a fascinating career it took him both through senior roles in World War II and then the Admiral of the the Royal Indian Navy towards the latter part. So he was there at partition. So he had some fairly major roles around the place. And in fact, when my son did a project, one of those projects in schools where you have to write a paragraph about each of your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, and he came to his great-grandparent, and we discovered that Godfrey had been present at every single one of Nicholas's history topics that year for the current century, which was a fascinating sort of connect. But anyway, when we were visiting him in 1974, I'd just taken my wife over to England to meet the wider parts of the family. And I was expressing an interest in a career in astronomy, and he said, I think I can help you. The astronomers and the Navy are really close buddies, so I'll take you to have I'll book an afternoon tea with the Astronomer Royal for you. And so we rocked up there, and it was a lesson in what punctuality means. So we drove up there, we arrived in plenty of time. We stopped when we were within sight of the destination, but not yet there. He checked his clock. This is naval punctuality. He checked his watch. At the appropriate moment, he then took off, and we went over the drawbridge of Herstmonceux Castle, up to the doors, parked, in through the doors, were announced as the clock struck the half hour. And so that was just a little, then we had afternoon tea together. Yeah, just a little thing. But anyway, it was Martin Ryle time, indeed. So let me just roll you back, because life was actually very different there, even though it's within my lifetime and within many of your lifetimes as well. Telephones sat on desks with a handset attached to a coil cable, and a call outside Wellington was a toll call, and you had to book it, and then you had to go through the local post office operator to get there, and you had to get permission to make it because they were expensive. So it had to be discussed with the clerk. Letters were handwritten, typed up by the office clerk, then proofread, then corrected, then signed, filed, posted. Incoming mail was collected from the post office in the morning by the clerk and then distributed into your inboxes, sorted and put into everybody in trays by morning tea. So post-morning tea, you had to process your letters. Staff memos went through a similar sort of a process. But what you get from that is that the office clerk is a real mine of information about everything that's happening in the office, because they see everything that everybody's written. So they are the person to keep up to date with if you need to know anything about how the office works. We had one programmable calculator that had a little printer attached to it. It was one of those reels, real things like you get with receipts and that sort of thing. It had print results on it. It occupied an office all of its own, pride of place on the table. Computers occupied other dedicated rooms. They weren't personal. They didn't sit on a desktop, even less on a laptop. Dr. Goozle was the librarian, aided by a library card catalogue. So it was really important. The librarian role was actually a really important role. Telescopes had setting circles, and you had to use star catalogues and charts to find anything of any difficulty. And there were massive tomes of printed coordinates that you also had to have, to the extent that I bought my own set of SAO charts of the world, which go down to 8th or 9th magnitude, and I still have them, and I annotated them for my master's thesis. Because otherwise you couldn't annotate them if it was the library copy, right? So these things were really important. And cameras used film, and telescopes used 4x4 or 5-inch glass plates, which you'd have to process in the darkroom at the end of your evenings observing, etc. So that's just a snapshot of what was different. Carter Observatory, the staff at that point was a relatively small staff. Dr. Murray Lewis was the director of the time. He'd only just been appointed when I was around. And he was the first trained astronomer as director. The others, I'm not repudiating one moment their skills, but they weren't trained. They were self-trained, if you like. And I've put the clerk next. I wonder why, but in the hierarchy. So that was Miss Alwyn Jones, and she had been there for a very long time. So she was also your reference source for what had happened when, going back. The assistant was Alan Gilmore, who we heard a moment about, and he was ably assisted by Pam, who was the librarian at the time, and it was a magnificent team. I arrived, and I can't actually remember. I was there before I was appointed scientific officer. So I was there from 74 through to 78, and Graham Blow took over from me in 78. Then there was a technician / observer, Russell Millington. We'll be hearing more about him. He was the sort of person, morning tea was, especially Monday, was a fascinating conversation. Because in all probability, Russell had left work mid-afternoon on Friday, driven all night, caught a ferry, driven all night, then been helicoptered up onto the glaciers somewhere, done some mountaineering over a peak and spent some Saturday night in some remote windswept place, then walked back out again down to some low spot and managed to get back again, driven all night, ferry driven through all night to arrive home at work at time for morning tea. So he was a real character, and a salt of the earth sort of a person, and he lives in Nelson at the moment. I can't remember his name, but we also had a senior engineer. Pretty certain his name was Jim, but I can't. Maybe John. Maybe you remember his name. Oh, Wen, right. Yes. Thank you. And then later on, once Black Birch was occupied, Frank Andrews became a staff member down in the South Island there. So, and I've just got an alternative quote from Alan and Pam over on the right-hand side here. Left when the administration became insufferable. So, yes, it was an interesting relationship between staff and Murray, and maybe there will be a couple of stories along those lines, amongst others in here as well. So what did the building itself look like? I'm not quite sure exactly where we are at the moment in terms of this building, but this was the building footprint as it was when I was part of it. So the current entrance sort of has taken over all of this area here. We've got the Ruth Crisp dome, the 9-inch dome, under which was the kitchen, and also the lathe and mill workshop where we made precision engineering workshop. The computer, when it arrived, occupied this office here. The clerk space was here. The library here was then underneath the library was the calculator room, a visitor assistant that then became my office, and then the director's office over on the right-hand side here. And then we had dark rooms for processing the plates and those sorts of things. And I seem to remember that this was the Royal Astronomical Society's rooms or the Wellington Astronomical Society's rooms, as well as our staff tea room. And then there was an instrument room for processing things. So the Carter Observatory had recently been named the National Observatory. And so it was struggling with what that actually meant. And so there were it meant it had this sort of national role for disseminating authoritative information. Remember, there was no Google, there was no way of looking any of these things up. We would run calculations to localize the times for sunrise, sunset, moonrise, set phases, and so forth, eclipses, occultations, and meteors, and all of these sorts of things. We would run calculations and publish them in the monthly sky charts. I noticed Alan is still using exactly the same chart. And for 3 years, I was the person who wrote those the monthly what to see at night with, and back then, of course, it wasn't photographic. It was all what you could see with the naked eye and with a decent pair of binoculars, maybe at a stretch if you really wanted to push people around a little bit. And that was syndicated to a large number of newspapers around the country. And then annually, we produced the Carter Observatory Handbook, which had all of those charts in it in small format, and a number of other rising and setting times, moon setting times, and all of those sorts of things for sort of Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, or something or other like that. And then we also had a public education or outreach role. So we had open nights, school visits. We had a set of slides and a slide projector. It was about 40 slides or thereabouts, and you could give exactly the same, you could use exactly the same slide set, irrespective of whether your school visit was 6-year-olds or adults. And often the 7 or 8-year-olds ask much more interesting questions and more perceptive questions than those older ones. You would stretch the way you describe things essentially, but that same slide set was a very versatile slide set. And this was pretty fundamental to us because we had funding from the local city councils, Wellington predominantly, but also Pororo and Lower Hutt, maybe Upper Hutt, I can't quite remember, which basically funded the ability for the schools to come for visits for free. So they didn't have to pay for it one-on-one. And then the idea was that as a national observatory, we should also be doing some research. So what did that look like? So there were a number of different perspectives on what sorts of research we might do with the scale of observatory, the scale of systems we had, and so on. The first thing was to leverage New Zealand's southern hemisphere location and the time zone that it is in. And this was Alan and Pam's approach. And so they did a lot of chasing minor planets and comets as part of a global network of observers. So if somebody else took a couple of photographs and got, 2 observations at a short time apart, so they had just the starts of an orbital elements, then those would get broadcast through telegrams. Alan and Pam would pick those telegrams up, and if we had a clear night, they would be able to, we had the flexibility in terms of our observing time to be able to say, right, that is a priority of trying to get another photograph of that before it gets lost. And that gives us a longer time span. And because we are between South America and South Africa, that gives us a really critical part, because the longer it goes before the next photograph is taken, the less likely you are to pick it up, or the harder it becomes to pick it up. So they had a really key role in that. I can remember doing many observations for those sorts of reasons as well. And that was done with photographic plates. So you had to aim it, you had to estimate where it was going to get to, take the plate, take it in for processing, process the plate, do the measurements, and then send a telegram off first thing in the morning. The next way is to use other people's data. And this was Murray's approach. So you leverage some innovative thinking of your own or your team's, and you look at published data and you reprocess it. You look at it in a different way. And so Murray did a lot of work looking at the redshifts of galaxies and galaxy clusters and modeling those and working out what the dynamics were of the cluster and working out whether there was missing mass there or whether the mass was sufficient to hold the gravitational forces of the galaxy group together. So that was a focus of quite a lot of his research. The next way was to have an innovative approach to the instrumentation. And this is what David Beagle-Hole, Joe Trodal, and Dennis Sullivan's approach was. And I was lucky to be one of their first MSc students, I think, in this. And so they had a photomultiplier tube, which, if you like, is a 1-pixel camera. And so each photon that comes in, basically through a cascade process of, through electron photomultiplier through here, then you measure the pulse, so you can then count the photons as they come down the telescope. And what we did, here's a picture of the whole telescope, and this is actually the Mount John telescope, not the main one. I wasn't allowed to let loose on that, but I was given a week on this one. So here's the photomultiplier tube. You know, it's about this round and about this long, so it's a significant piece of delicate apparatus. It's mounted here behind this box, and you can see a stepping motor here. So this has got a circular array of filters in it. So it has the equivalent of a UVBY set of filters in it, but it also had a semicircular wedge interference filter. And the motor wasn't a continuous motor, it stepped it. So you looked at, as it went round, and it went round continuously. I can't remember how often it went round, but it went round pretty quickly. And at each step, you counted a few photons, and then after it had been round over over a 10-minute span or something rather like that, you'd build up a whole spectrum for the star that you were looking at. And the advantage of using this approach here was that as the atmosphere changes, if you use a traditional thing where you have UVBY filters and you have a camera plate, photographic plate behind each one, by the time you've taken 4 UVBY and a blank photographs, each of 10 minutes, the atmosphere has shifted. And so that means that your color for the star is affected by the atmosphere in a way that you're not quite sure. Whereas here, because we were collecting a full spectrum, a tiny little bit of it, not very much of it, but building it up through the time, meant that our spectrum was much more robust in terms of its relationship with the atmosphere. And this required a whole lot of electronics to drive it, required a PDP-8, which had 4K of memory, and had to be programmed by keying in the first few instructions, and then you would program that in, and then it would read the program off a tape, which was an audio tape, essentially, an electronic paper tape. And then, as you were building up a signal, it would display it on the oscilloscope, and it was more efficient. The picture that came up on the oscilloscope as it went past each scan was a full spectrum representing one rotation. It took too many instructions to turn that upside down. It was much better just to turn this oscilloscope upside down so that the spectrum was the way around you expected it to be. I mean, this just gives you an indication of, how much innovation went through into putting together all these little bits and pieces. So this was a trailer load, in order to take this 1-pixel camera down to Mount John, and then fit it up and do all the balancing and everything else. So my master's thesis took 3 years to do, and that was because it took 3 years before I had the observing windows that I needed to be able to collect the data that was needed. And even then it was another 3 years before Joe and Dennis had gathered enough data to actually publish something which they had hoped that I might have been able to publish as part of my MSc. I think that was a slight overestimate, the amount of effort in the MSc. Anyway, that was that. So to support those different endeavors, we had a library, and a key part of that library was, as I say, the data was the astronomical journals that we subscribed to. In order to do Murray's modeling, we had other bits of information as well. So for instance, we built a blink comparator. So if you've got 2 photographs You lay one and you light them alternately. So you align them, put them through a binocular viewer, and so your eye sees one then the other, and anything that changes brightness as you're looking at is a variable star or a moving object, something or other like that. And so having a blink comparator was really useful, and that was built in our workshop. And we employed a skilled fitter and turner and bought the precision milling machine in order to do that. We also bought a computer. It was one of these devices. So this was a slightly bigger one than the one that we put in the telescope. Now, Murray was a theoretical astronomer. He was not particularly good when it came to practical things. So, for instance, this was ordered from overseas. It arrived at Wellington Airport. He hired a little one-ton truck, go to the airport when he was told it was there to get, picked it up, put it on the back of the truck, drove gingerly out of the airport, around the corner. Hadn't noticed that the vibrations, after all, this wasn't very heavy, it was walking off the back of the tray. I think it walked off the tray within 200 or 300 meters of it. Luckily, they were quite robust in those days. There were no valves in there, and it was fine. And then we were also looking for a better site for the Boller and Chivens, the Ruth Chris 26-inch. And once again, this was another source of tension between staff. Murray was keen to use the Boller and Chivens for his research, but none of us wanted to let him loose on his own. A telescope needs to be balanced very, very carefully when you put different instrumentation on it. It needs to be balanced in all the different directions. And its electronics is finely tuned in order to be able to drive the telescope when it is in balance. But Murray wasn't particularly good at getting it to perfect balance. And so he found that when he put it on slew, that it would blow fuses. And his answer was to replace the fuse with the slow bow fuse. This was, sort of cringe material from other staff members who said, it's a fast blow fuse for a reason to protect the electronics, Murray, Can we give you a little bit more help to teach you how to, balance things properly? No, I know how to balance it. Anyway, moving on. So we were wanting a better site for this. And so this was what was considered to be an optimal site. This was, number of criteria. So you could look at those criteria. You could think of places that might meet that criteria. And so vast number of places. This is one page of potential sites in New Zealand, number of them. And down here, you'll find Mount Bitterness. Now, you'd think that Mount Bitterness, we would take a hint from the name. But no, all of its other characteristics were looking very promising. So out of this long list, desk list, the short list was made. We had Black Birch up the top here. This is Mount John. And then this cluster of Otago ones, of which Mount Bitterness must be one of this one here, I think. And it was decided that we wanted to find out about that. And so we find this letter. Things have been a bit slow over Christmas. We've got our computer. Russell and Robert are getting set up on Mount Bitterness with a lashed up seeing telescope. It uses a 6-inch refractor of Gary Nankivell's and lenses and camera from the Questar. At the back of it. Bitterness is the high range one sees running along the road from the coast towards Mount Cook and Otamatata. And it reaches just over 6,000 feet. It's very, very stony and desolate on its top. observing on the exposed ridges up on top there was interesting on clear nights, even in midsummer. The site should be excellent for getting bugs out of such expeditions. Okay. So, Mount Bitterness, here we are. This one here is Mount Bitterness, and you can see the sort of lack of vegetation around it. So here we have that road that was being referred to. Here's Lake Wakatipu with Avonmore just above it. And you have promising names such as Rugged Ridges Station, but also Sunny Peaks Station. So maybe this is promising. This is what it actually looks like on the top. This is exposed stuff, and I want you to note, because it'll be relevant later, all of these flat stones with their jagged edges that sort of sit all the way across this summit area here, and most of that unvegetated area is covered in that sort of stone. This isn't my photograph. It's not our photograph. It was one that's just found on Pinkery, New Zealand website. And so we were sent off with this letter. The bearer of this letter is Mr. Russell Millington, technician of Carter Observatory. He is in the field in command of a team of 2 that is investigating the astronomical usefulness of mountaintop sites. For his purpose, he needs to camp close to the summit for a period of time that may last as long as 2 months. Generally, he will be accompanied by assistant. Mr. Millington is a careful and reliable worker, etc., etc. Can I ask you to give him every reasonable assistance? So this is what we were trying to do. Here's a 6-inch telescope. It's about 6 feet long, so they're about f11 or thereabouts. You can see here there's an SLR camera on the bottom of it. And the idea is that you, in the northern hemisphere, you point this at Polaris and you leave it recording for a certain length of time. And that produces a trail on about half the width of a 35mm frame. And if it's a lovely straight line like that, then you've got really good seeing. If it's down in these regions here, then your seeing is nothing like as good as that. And so that was our aim, was to do that sort of thing in the southern hemisphere. Of course, in the southern hemisphere, we don't have Polaris. We have sigma octans, which is just visible with the naked eye. In fact, I got to the point where I could spot sigma octans driving along a road and just glancing up into the sky. My eyes were much better then than they are now, I can tell you. So that's a northern hemisphere result. And we spent some time. So we had this telescope. We had an aluminium angle iron frame that we assembled in order to point it accurately to the southern hemisphere, the South Polar Star. And then we were expected to assemble this frame, put piers, stone piers around each of the legs in order to hold it down against the wind, etc., so that this was atmospheric motion and not the motion of the telescope. And so on. And we had a 4-wheel drive that we'd hired. It had a trailer because there was quite a lot of kit. We were planning to be there for most of a month. So we had quite a lot of tents and all of those sorts of things. I remember one occasion, I'm not quite sure why, maybe he'd gone back to get supplies and I was at the campsite on my own and the wind got up and it was wet and a gust of wind had pulled a couple of peg lines out. And I was left holding a pole, not wanting to let go of it because I did not want the whole thing to head off, but there were 2 pegs, neither of which I could get to re-establish them. And I was in there holding on for dear life until Russell returned with the provisions. Health and safety, yes. So anyway, so in the end, yes, Bitterness site abandoned long before the month was up. Telegram sent back from the local post office. And so in the, oh, sorry, that's not quite what I intended So anyway, there's a couple of letters underneath there, which is what Murray was writing and thanking various station owners for the fact that they had given us access to their land and all of that sort of thing. And so he was writing these nice, pleasant thank you letters and saying, yeah, so the weather wasn't particularly good, but we learned a lot, you know. Russell, on the other hand, was having to cope with this. We're in receipt of your invoice for hire of the car, of the Land Rover. A charge is being made for the full cost of 4 new tyres. We feel that this charge is not fully justified. No allowance has been made for the fact that 3 of the tyres are still usable. And in your running cost, 8 cents per kilometre is allowed for tyre wear. The vehicle was hired especially for cross-country work where conditions are expected to be fairly rigorous. The problem was we had to travel some substantial different distances multiple times across that scree slope with those rocks with their sharp edges, and they had lacerated the edges of the tyres of not just the 4 on the Land Rover, but the 2 on the trailer as well. The vehicle was returned in good condition, etc., etc. So you see, there were 2 different sort of experiences happening here of what we'd been through. Moving on from there, life at Black Birch was a completely different kettle of fish, because Black Birch actually had a field station, which had been put on there with 2 prototype towers. This was by Bateson, about 15 years earlier, when he'd been doing site testing for what finished up as being Mount John. And so here we are at Black Birch. There's me enjoying, and my wife is doing some bird photography on this occasion. When we were up there, we had to do, you know, weather observations the whole time. And that was part of the site observing too, so that every seeing evening we had to do hourly temperatures and humidity and all of those sorts of things. And here we built a concrete pier, because this was going to be a longer term thing. So this was pier version number 2 rather than pier version number 1, which is the aluminium tripod. And so you start to see it there, view of the ranges nearby. And there it is with the telescope. I can tell you, when we were there, we did not have enough concrete blocks to build a wall around it. So when we were there, we were doing this in the middle of the night without the benefit of any windshields. Not quite sure who that is. It doesn't look like Russell. It's more likely, I think, Frank Andrews. So I think this was actually a little bit later. And then ultimately, the dome was built by Norski in Blenheim. Norski, if you've been tramping and you've encountered those cylindrical toilets, long drop toilets, they're made by Norski. Those are pure fiberglass, whereas their other technique that they use for boats is a foam sandwich. So they have a fairly rigid foam with an fiberglass skin on both sides, which means that you can form it to a shape and then put the fiberglass on. And so here's the assembled dome. It's too wide to put on a truck to take it up the road. So here it is being airlifted up to Black Birch. You can see there've been some modifications to the tower, and then it was put being lowered down into place. That design work for that tower, I remember in the tea room being fascinated the first time we got the drawings of what was going to happen here. And they'd come back from who had been doing the drawings and that sort of thing. I was looking at the drawings of the insides of here, the stairs and the floor and those sorts of things, and I was thinking, it's not quite right. Then I realized it was configured for the Northern Hemisphere. And so the stairs came up on the wrong side of the pier. That was fixed by this time, you know, it was all fixed. But yeah, the more eyes you can get on these diagrams, the better. And that, I think, oh no, so here's Russell This definitely is Russell. This is the lifting out of the Ruth Crisp out of the dome here. And that's Russell, obviously, just helping it out. So that all happened in 1978. So that was the year I had left by the time this happened, because I'd gone overseas to do a year overseas, having handed in my master's. Yeah. Thank you.